Islam has come to elevate the status of women, where women were given a great importance, and their active role in Islam appeared since the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And many women who had merit in Islam emerged and had distinguished position in support of Islam. And in this video will come a statement of the most prominent women who left an impact in Islam. Khadija bint Khuwaylid, the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad and the mother of all of his children except for his son Ibrahim. Khadija had a wide business. She used to send men in her trade to the Levant and Yemen. When Khadija heard about the Prophet and about his honesty and truthfulness, she shared with him in her trade, and then they got married. Khadija lived with the Prophet Muhammad during the period before the mission, and she was sensing the prophecy of her husband. When God revealed his revelation to the Prophet, Khadija was the first to believe in his revelation. She was the first man and woman to believe in Prophet, and the first to perform ablution and pray. She prayed with the Prophet on the same day that Jibreel taught him. When the messenger was heading to the cave of Hira, Khadija supported him, and she would prepare for him what he needed in his solitude of food and drink. The year in which Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet, and Khadija died was called the year of grief, and the messenger of God did not forget his love for Khadija after her death, as she was the example of good and loyal wife who supported the messenger with herself and her money and believed in him when the revelation came to him. Aisha bint Abi Bakr. If we talk about the greatest woman in Islam, we must mention the mother of the believers, Aisha. May God please her. She was the third and youngest wife of the Prophet Muhammad. In Islamic writing, her name is thus often prefixed by the title Mother of the Believers, referring to the description of Prophet Muhammad's wife in the Quran. The daughter of Abu Bakr and Roman, Aisha belonged to the Bani Taym clan of the Quraysh. Aisha had essential role in early Islamic history, both during the Prophet Muhammad's life and after his death. She contributed to the spread of the Prophet Muhammad's message and served the Muslim community for 44 years after his death. Her intellect and knowledge in various subjects, including poetry, were highly praised by early luminaries such as Az-Zuhair and his student Arwa ibn Zubayr. Aisha was one of the most knowledgeable women in the religion of Islam and the Quran, interpretation and hadith. Aisha was one of the most narrators of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, and this due the fact that she was always with him. Sauda bint Zam'a. She is the second wife of the Prophet Muhammad, one of the mothers of the believers, and one of the first foreigners in Islam. She was born in Mecca in Quraysh family. She was the wife of the Sakran ibn Amr, and she gave birth to his son Abdullah and immigrated with him in the second immigration to the country of Abyssinia. Sakran and his wife returned to Mecca, and he died before migrating to Medina. She was the first woman the Prophet Muhammad married after Khadija's death. She was known for her generosity, so when Umar ibn al-Khattab sent her a lot of money, she divided among all poor. Sauda narrated 5 hadiths from Prophet's hadith. She did not perform Hajj after the death of the Prophet and stayed in her house until she died. Hafsa bint Umar. She is the fourth wife of the Prophet Muhammad and one of the mothers of the believers, the daughter of the second Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab and the sister of companion Abdullah ibn Umar. She was born 5 years before the mission and converted to Islam in Mecca with her father. She immigrated with her first husband, Khunis ibn Hudayfa, to Yathrib, which was later called Medina. Her husband died as a result of being wounded in the Battle of Uhud. Then the Prophet married her. Hafsa was known to be jealous of the Prophet Muhammad by his other wives. She was known for her eloquence. Hafsa stayed in her home after the death of the Prophet Muhammad and did not leave it. She narrated several hadith in the authority of the Prophet and on her father, amounting to 60 hadith. Hafsa died in Medina and was buried in Al-Baqiyah. Zainab bint Khuzaymah. After the death of her husband, she entered Muhammad's house immediately after the entry of Hafsa bint Umar, and thus became the 5th mother of the believers. She was called the mother of poor, and she was one of the immigrants. Her husband Abdullah ibn Jahsh was killed in the Battle of Uhud, so Muhammad sent to her to be true with her for himself, and she replied to him saying, I made the matter of myself to you. So he married her in the month of Ramadan, 3 or 4 years after the migration, and she died in the 4th year. The period of her stay with the Prophet was 2 or 3 months. It is said to be 8 months. She was the first mother of the believers to be buried in Al-Baqiyah. Salama, one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad and one of the mothers of the believers. Her name was Hind bint Abu Umayyah. She was born in Mecca and grew up in the house of her father. Abu Umayyah was one of the masters of the Quraysh. The Prophet Muhammad married her after her husband died. Salama accompanied the Prophet on the number of innovations. Salama did not participate in the battle that took place after the death of the Prophet in compliance with his order, and she remained and lived in Medina. After the death of the Prophet, the companions used to ask her about the hadiths of the Prophet, and she narrated 378 hadiths. Salama died in Medina. She was the last of the mothers of the believers to die. She was buried in Al-Baqiyah cemetery. Zainab bint Jahsh. She was one of the wives of the Prophet and one of the mothers of the believers. She was born in Mecca 33 years before the Hijrah and grew up there. She was one of the first female immigrants to Medina, and she was married to Zayd ibn Haritha. The Prophet married her after her divorce from Zayd ibn Haritha. Zainab was known for her love of godliness and her abundance of alms. She narrated some of the hadiths of the Prophet. After Prophet Muhammad's death, she stayed in her home until she died. Her death was in Medina, and she was buried in Al-Baqiyah. Juwayriyah bint al-Harith, the 8th wife of the Prophet Muhammad. Her father, the great companion, the master of Bani al-Mustaliq, whose name is Al-Harith ibn Abi Dirara. She converted to Islam after her father and 2 brothers became Muslim. The Prophet Muhammad named her Juwayriyah, although her real name was Bura. Juwayriyah memorized several hadiths, and she was 20 years old when she married the Prophet and narrated 7 hadiths from the Prophet. She died in Medina, probably in the year 56, and Marwan ibn al-Hakim, the governor of Medina, prayed over her, and she was buried in Al-Baqiyah. Habiba. Her name is Ramla bint Abi Sufyan. The Prophet married her after the death of her husband, Ubaydullah ibn Jahsh. Habiba is one of the cousins of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and none of his wives are more closely related to him than her. She married the Prophet at the age of 36. She narrated from the Prophet Muhammad 65 hadiths. It was said that she visited her brother Muawiyah and died in Damascus, so she was buried in the Bab al-Saghir cemetery. However, most sources said that she died in Medina during the time of her brother Muawiyah's caliphate and was buried in Al-Baqiyah. Safiya bint Hayy, the 10th wife of the Prophet Muhammad. She was a prisoner, so the Prophet chose her for himself and gave her the choice between Islam and remaining in her religion. Safiya chose Islam, so she became Muslim, and the Prophet married her. According to Muslim historians, the goal of the Prophet in this marriage is to honor her, raise her status, and compensate her with good for those she lost from her family and people. She died and she was buried in Al-Baqiyah. At the end of this video, it's clear how Muslim women had really influential rule in Islam. It's not only the women we mentioned who had influential rule. Of course, mothers of the believers have a very special place, but also there are many women who have great roles in religion and life matters.